Hey guys, so in this video we are going to be unpacking Ephesians chapter 2 verses 1 through 10 and we're going to see how the church is now alive through Jesus Christ. So from the great heights of Ephesians chapter 1, where Paul has been describing all of our spiritual blessings in Jesus Christ, Paul now takes like a roller coaster dive into the present reality of where we are at as sinners, because he says in chapter 2 verses 1, "As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins." An emphasis on the dead there, as in that we have no spiritual capital before God, that we are totally incapable of searching after God if it were not for his prior intervention and his grace stirring our hearts towards him. And Paul mentions that we are both dead in transgressions and sins. What's the difference between these? Well, transgression speaks of trespassing or violating, consciously breaking God's law. It speaks of us as rebels against God. Sin speaks of missing the mark, falling short. It speaks of us as failures before God. So we are dead before God because we are both failures and rebels. So next in verse 2, Paul describes the context of our sin and transgression against God. He says, "In which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient." So the way of this world is not accustomed to follow God, it is accustomed to sin and trespass against God. The way of this world is dictated by the ruler of the kingdom of the air, which is a funny name given to Satan, and it simply refers to the fact that he kind of controls the airwaves, that he influences the air that we breathe, the culture that we live in, which is the culture of disobedience against God and not following God. That's why it says that he is the spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. Satan is the one who is influencing us and encouraging us to not follow God, but to sin and trespass against him. Next in verse 3, we can see the effects of our sin and transgression against God. Paul writes, "All of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath." So the way this works out is that the spirit of evil, which is at work amongst us, causes us to gratify the cravings of our sinful flesh, so that we sin and trespass against God in order that we become objects or deserving of his wrath. So the spirit of evil, Satan, is constantly pushing us and encouraging us against God and away from God and towards death. Now this might look like a completely hopeless situation in how we are dead in our sin and transgression, but this is where we get to one of the great big buts of the Bible, because Paul writes in verse 4, "But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgression. It is by grace you have been saved." So even though we were dead in our sin and transgression, even though we were objects of wrath because of our offense against God, God, who is great in love and rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ. You see, our sin and our transgression was deep, but his love was deeper still. And this just shows us the great extent of God's grace, that it is all by his grace. And if it were not for his grace awakening our hearts to him, we would still be lost and dead in our sin and transgression. And not only has God made us alive with Christ, even though we were dead in sins and transgression and objects of his wrath, but it says in verse 6, "And God raised us up in Christ and seated us with him in the heavenly realms in Christ Jesus." So not only has God made us alive, but he has raised us up, exalted us, and seated us with him in the heavenly realms in Christ Jesus. Yet this is for a purpose, and it is not only for our blessing, because it says in verse 7, "In order that in the coming ages he might show the incomparable riches of his grace expressed in his kindness to us in Christ Jesus." You see, the purpose of God's kindness to us in making us alive in Jesus and seating us with him in the heavenly realms is so that he can show the incomparable riches of his grace. And just in thought anybody had a key part to play in their salvation process, Paul writes in verse 8, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. Paul says that we have been given a gift from God, and that gift is salvation by grace alone. Nothing of our own merit, nothing of our own righteousness, nothing of our own goodness, not by works, so that no one can boast. And finally, Paul then describes the second purpose for why God has made the church alive in Christ. He says in verse 10, "For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." So not only has God made the church alive in Christ so that we might marvel at the riches of his grace, but that he has made the church alive in Christ to do good works as well. Paul also writes in Titus 2:14, Jesus gave himself for us to redeem us from all wickedness and to purify for himself a people that are his very own, eager to do what is good. So God has made the church alive in Christ to marvel at his grace and glory, but also to exhibit his good and godly character through good works. So there we have it. Ephesians chapter 2 verses 1 through 10 shows us that even though we were dead in our sin and transgression, even though we were objects of wrath, God, who is great in love and rich in mercy, has made us alive in Christ Jesus and seated us with him in the heavenly realms. And he has done this so that he might show the incomparable riches of his grace and that we might exhibit his godly character through good works. And most importantly, that we are saved by grace and grace alone. The church is alive in Jesus Christ. Thanks for watching, guys. If you've enjoyed this video, then why not give me a thumbs up, stick in a comment below, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button and also check out the verse by verse commentary in the link below. I'll see you next time.